Hey everyone, warm South Pacific greetings to everyone tuning in. Kia ora, kia rana, talofa lava, whakalofalai atu, misapula vanaka, taloha ni, malo lei. And if there's a couple of Australian cousins out there, g'day, and something about putting some seafood on a barbecue. But welcome anyways. My name is Daniel Toleafua, and this interview is brought to you by Student Life New Zealand and Athletes in Action New Zealand. We want to serve the audience out there on what we would deem as the hot topic, a question that's been in the minds of many for many years. Now, straight into it, we have our guest speaker who needs no introduction. Dr. William Lane Craig has quite the curriculum vitae. So he has 2 degrees, one in philosophy, one in theology. He runs a website called reasonablefaith.org, so check that out. He has tackled many hard questions with some pretty big, top-hitting, like world-renowned, prolific figures. There's a lot of words. Stemming from the late Christopher Hitchens to Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion. We got Lawrence Krauss. We also have Sam Harris, a favorite of mine, Jordan B. Petersen as well. And the list goes on. And so, Dr. Craig is definitely not allergic to big debates. I am, so I want to do the easy job tonight. I am going to ask the questions, pre-submitted questions from the audience, and he's going to answer them for us tonight. So, Dr. Craig, good to have you here. Welcome to the cyber waters of the South Pacific. How's everything in the US?
Very good, actually, and it's great to be with you, Daniel. I remember our previous 2 visits to New Zealand, and what a wonderful time we had there. And so it's great to join you half the world away for this interview today. Great.
I want to hold all my fanboy energy right now because I'm so excited to see Dr. Craig. But for the sake of brevity, the topic for today is, do Kiwis really need God? Do Kiwis really need God? We are not trying to be provocative over here. As part of the story behind this interview, we go back to 2015. The New Zealand Herald once wrote an article called Wellington, the Godless Capital. Wellington, the Godless Capital. And it brought out the stats of the Wellington population at that time when it comes to religion. I think it was like close to 50% of the Wellington population, so Wellington is the capital of New Zealand, consider themselves non-religious. But then it got me thinking, well, what's the stats ever since that time, building up to maybe like even the last census? And over here it says 2001, the census for New Zealand was 29.6% of the population considered themselves non-religious. 2006, 34.6%. 2013, 41.9%. And 2018, 48.2% of the New Zealand population consider themselves non-religious. So I feel like it begs the question, do Kiwis really need God? And I feel like wherever this answer goes, we got an adventure on our hands. And so to supplement this dialogue, we thought we'd get the big guns, we'd get the big heavy hitters. And why not start with Dr. William Lane Craig to help us or to supplement this topic in our minds. The format for today is quite simple. I ask on behalf of the many questions that you guys have been texting in or messaging in, and then Dr. William Lane Craig will answer them. So, shall we get into it, Doctor?
Yes, let's go ahead.
All right. We'll start off with this. You work for a ministry called Reasonable Faith, and you combine what many have viewed as an oxymoron title, reason and faith. Why have you combined the 2 terms?
This name comes from my book, Reasonable Faith. And the title for that book was actually selected by the publisher. When the publisher suggested it, I thought it was sort of a milquetoast title. I thought, well, this isn't exciting or dynamic at all. Reasonable Faith, big deal. And I never realized how controversial, as you say, this label is in the minds of many people today. They think it's an oxymoron. And I think that's completely wrong. It seems to me that reason and faith fit hand in glove, and that to put one's trust in God and in Jesus Christ is a perfectly reasonable thing for an informed, thinking man or woman in the 21st century to do.
All right. We have a question here. Why can't we just get along, try our best, read the progression reports in this culture, and not believe in God?
Perhaps we can, but I don't say that we need to believe in God in order to get along. I think it's very, very important to understand that I am not suggesting that people need to believe in God as a sort of psychological crutch, or that Kiwis need God in order to live good moral lives or to have a civic society. That's not my view at all. For me, this isn't a psychological question. This is a truth question. Is there objectively a being who transcends the universe, is personal and good, and has created the world and everything in it? And has he revealed himself in the person of Jesus of Nazareth to enable us to come into an eternal, loving, saving relationship with him? I think there is such a person. And that's why I think we ought to believe in God, not in order to get along or because we need God for a civic society. That's all beside the point for me. As a philosopher, the question for me is it true? And since I think it is, I therefore think that a reasonable person should trust in God in the way I described.
All right. We have someone here saying, famous podcaster and ex-UFC fighter, Mr. Joe Rogan, mentioned that Christianity and science are at odds. What would be your thoughts to that?
Well, I would say that this is an uninformed point of view. I doubt that Joe Rogan has read very much theology, and I doubt that he really knows all that much about science. I have tried my best as an intellectually responsible person to master the rough outlines of the contemporary scientific worldview. I've especially focused upon physics and relativity theory, both the special and general theory, as well as quantum mechanics. And I think that contemporary science is more open to the existence of a transcendent creator and designer of the universe than at any time in the last few hundred years. So far from being incompatible, I would say that science and theology go well together, and that there is a flourishing conversation going on today between professional theologians and scientists.
Well, just to supplement that person's question, what are some examples of that where they are cohesive or they work in harmony with each other? Yeah. And what's some examples of what science can't prove, in all its glory, but like what's some bullet points, things that that science can't prove that other things can prove when it comes to truth?
All right, let's start with the first question, which was what areas of concord are there that I spoke of? One is the amazing discovery in the early part of the 20th century that the universe is not infinite in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. Down through history, from ancient Greek materialists right up through the 19th century, the prevailing view was that the universe is, in effect, an eternal, static entity that has just always existed. And that worldview was upended by Albert Einstein's discovery of the general theory of relativity and its application to the universe as a whole, which made scientists realize that the universe, far from being static, is actually in a state of cosmic expansion. The galaxies in the universe are growing farther and farther apart as time goes on. And the incredible implication of this is that as you trace the expansion back in time, the entire universe shrinks down to a beginning a finite time ago, probably around 14 billion years, before which it literally did not exist. And so this is dramatic confirmation of the biblical doctrine of creation, that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is just one area of concord between modern physics and the Bible. A second area would be the discovery on the part of contemporary cosmologists that the Big Bang event, far from being chaotic, was fine-tuned from its very inception with a delicacy and complexity that literally defy human comprehension. The fundamental constants and quantities of nature fall within an exquisitely, incomprehensibly narrow, life-permitting range, such that if these constants and quantities were altered by less than a hair's breadth, the universe would be life-prohibiting. And the best explanation of this, I think, is that it's due to design. The alternatives, that it's just an accident or that it's physically necessary, have been rejected by many prominent astrophysicists as implausible explanations. By contrast, I think the explanation that Christian theology gives, that the world is the product of an intelligent designer and creator, is confirmed by these discoveries. So even if you don't regard these discoveries as proofs of God, I think what you can say at least is that these are areas of concord where the Christian stands comfortably within the scientific mainstream in affirming that there's a transcendent creator and designer of the universe. Now, what would be areas where science cannot address the questions? Well, these would be areas, for example, like ethics. Do objective moral values really exist? Are certain things really objectively wrong? Or are these just the subjective viewpoints that have been instilled into us as a result of evolutionary conditioning and social conditions or parental training? And I would argue here that the view that moral values and duties are objective and are grounded in a transcendent being whose nature is perfect goodness and who is the source of the moral law gives us a basis for ethics which is far, far superior than anything that the atheist can provide. So that would be one area where science just doesn't address the question of the objectivity of moral values and duties, but theology does.
Thank you. Why do we need an intelligent mind to support the existence of God? Why can't it just be an energy force engaging with us?
Because, as I've just said, an impersonal energy force cannot fine-tune the constants and quantities of the universe. This requires an intelligent decision maker who can set the laws of nature and the constants and quantities to just the right values so as to render the universe life permitting. A blind energy force is simply incapable of explaining that sort of fine-tuning.
I like this question. What is your go-to argument that, because you work with university students a lot, what is your go-to argument to start a healthy dialogue about a belief in God?
I think it's really important, Daniel, that we don't open with an argument. Rather, we open with questions. You ask the other person what he believes. Does he think there is a God? Does he think there's a creator? Does he think there's a source of objective moral values and duties? If he believes all those things already, there's no need to present arguments for the existence of God. On the other hand, if he is an atheist or an agnostic, then you'll need to begin to present some arguments, such as the ones that I've just mentioned, as to why it makes good sense to believe in God. But we need to, first of all, be good listeners.
Yeah, my wife says that as well. So duly noted. Someone referenced Jordan B. Petersen.
Yes.
He states that he acts as if God exists.
Yeah.
Is that lifestyle healthy?
I think that it is healthy, but it's incomplete. It's healthy because if you act as if God exists, then you will act as if other people have intrinsic moral value, and therefore they are to be treated as ends in themselves and not merely means to be used for your own personal ends. And so if you behave in such a way as if you believe that God exists, I think this will make you a more ethical, more loving, and more responsible person and a better citizen. But the tragedy of that is that it's incomplete. Why not actually believe that God exists? Then you can be living consistently with your worldview. If you're just living as if he exists, then you border almost on hypocrisy. If you don't really think that God exists, then why are you living that way? It seems to me that it's much, much better to have a consistent worldview where you can live out what you actually do believe.
We have one from, we won't state names over here, but I'm on the fence, but it's too hard / draining to figure out or choose what belief is right. What do I do?
I really, really sympathize. In our information age, we suffer from information overload, and it's so hard to make your way through some of these things. So I would say, in view of the importance of this question, you can't just ignore it. It's too important. It's about the meaning of your life and human destiny. So I would encourage the person to embark on a sort of spiritual experiment. I would encourage him to begin to read the New Testament, especially the Gospels, the life of Jesus, and ask himself, who was this man? Could what he is saying really be true? Could he really have been the Son of God and risen from the dead? And then at the same time, I would encourage him to read a book like my book, On Guard. Now, I'm not trying to promote my book. Get it from the library. Don't go out and buy it, just borrow it. But read On Guard, read the arguments in support of the existence of God and his self-revelation in Jesus, and then maybe watch a debate or two that I've had with non-Christians like Christopher Hitchens or Lawrence Krauss when I was on that 4-city tour in Australia, and just ask yourself, which way does the evidence point? Who's got the better arguments? And I feel very confident that if our listener will embark on that kind of spiritual experiment with an open mind and an open heart, that he may well come to find faith in God and in Christ.
The next one, there's a lot of exclamation marks, and it's all in capitals.
Oh dear. Uh-oh.
What? Brace yourself.
All right.
Why the emphasis on the cosmological arguments? Why the emphasis on the cosmological arguments to believe in God?
Well, that's very easy. That's personal. That's just autobiographical. When I was in college, I was taught that there are no good arguments for God's existence. And yet I've always wondered where the universe came from. Ever since I was a little boy, I thought it had to have a cause. It had to come from someplace. But my university professors told me that that's not a good argument for God's existence, so I just believed them. But after I graduated, I came across a book by Stuart Hackett, a philosopher, called The Resurrection of Theism. And in this book, Hackett defended a version of the cosmological argument. And he refuted every conceivable objection that I could think of to the argument. And I was just overwhelmed, Daniel. I thought, this is incredible. I've got to find out if Hackett is right, if this argument is sound or not. And so I determined that when I did my doctoral studies in philosophy at the University of Birmingham in England, that I would write my PhD thesis on the cosmological argument for God's existence. And I became convinced that the argument is sound. And 3 books came out of that doctoral study. And so the reason I'm enamored with the argument is just very, very personal. It deeply touched my life. I did my doctoral work on it. I'm convinced that it's a good argument. And that's why I have such a focus on it. But I certainly recognize that it's not for everybody and that others may find different arguments much more appealing.
Well, just for the sake of our audience out there who may be somewhat naive to the cosmological arguments, could you just give us a brief summary of what that is?
The particular argument that I'm talking about is very simple. It goes like this. Step 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Step 2, the universe began to exist, from which it follows 3, therefore the universe has a cause. And so you do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe, and a number of striking theologically significant properties of this first uncaused cause come out of such an analysis. So that the argument issues finally in a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which is, I think, the core concept of God.
So there's a plethora of questions over here that I guess riffs off that question, is that if there's a cause, everything that comes into effect has a cause.
Well, everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Okay, everything that begins to exist.
It's important that we state these premises carefully, or you'll get into contradictions and incoherences.
Fair enough. So everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Yeah.
So there's an assumption then that God began to exist as well. Therefore, the supplementary question is, what caused God? But go ahead.
But what the argument leads to is, as I say, an uncaused first cause, a being which never began to exist. Otherwise, if it did begin to exist, you would need a cause for it ad infinitum. But the second premise of the argument is that there cannot be an infinite regress of past causes. You have to come to a cause, which is the first uncaused cause that starts everything off.
My non-belief in God has served me well. People like me. I don't drink. I help people. I'm making good money. Why do I need to believe in God? This might be similar to the second question, but what would you say to that, Dr. Craig?
Well, I want to reiterate what I said about you don't need to believe in God in order to live a good life and be a nice person and a civic person and things about that. The reason you need to believe in God is because it's true. God does exist, and you need his forgiveness because you have violated his moral law. None of us has successfully discharged perfectly all of our moral obligations. And therefore, we need God's forgiveness and cleansing for our moral wrongdoing. And this is what he offers us through Christ. So that's why you need to believe in God.
We have someone labeled themselves as tongue-in-cheek. The moral arguments, I disagree. It makes me feel bad.
Oh.
What is the moral argument, Dr.
Okay,
Craig?
what is the moral argument? Well, this is an argument that has 3 simple steps as well. Step 1 is, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That is to say, on atheism, moral values and duties are relative. They're just the spin-offs of biological evolution and social conditioning. But there is no objective moral values or duties. Second premise is, but objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we encounter a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. For example, I think that probably every one of us recognizes that it is morally wrong to torture and rape a little girl. That isn't just a subjective opinion. That is an objective moral abomination. And from those 2 premises, it follows logically and inescapably that therefore God exists. Now, the reason it might make the listener feel bad is because that first premise, if true, is very depressing. It is what French existentialists called the absurdity of life without God. In the absence of God, there is no objective right and wrong. There is no good and evil. All of these values that we hold dear and guide our lives by are subjective illusions fobbed off on us by the evolutionary process and social conditioning. And that really, really is depressing. In fact, I think, Daniel, that probably no atheist has ever been able to live consistently and happily with an atheist worldview. If he lives consistently, he will be profoundly depressed. If he manages to live happily, it's only by living inconsistently with his atheism. Like the Jordan Petersen example you gave, I will live as if God exists. So that first premise is indeed depressing, but it's a conditional. It's as if God does not exist. But the argument shows, in fact, that God does exist, that the objectivity of moral values and duties that we apprehend in moral experience imply, in fact, that the atheist is wrong, that God does exist. So that's good news.
Belief in God and religion have caused more harm than good. Persuade me otherwise.
Oh, I wouldn't want to try to persuade you otherwise. I would not try that. My argument is not sociological. My argument is not Christianity has great social benefits, therefore you should believe in it. My argument is Christianity is true, therefore you should believe in it, whatever its social consequences. Let me give an example of this. Einstein's special theory of relativity has been grossly misunderstood in popular culture to mean that everything is relative. People confuse relativity with relativism. And so they thought that the theory of relativity implies that everything is relative, that it implies relativism. And so the theory of relativity has had very negative social consequences in terms of promoting relativism. But nevertheless, the theory is true. It doesn't matter what its social consequences are. It is a true scientific theory. And I would say exactly the same about Christianity. Now, having said that, Daniel, I think it's pretty easy really to show that the social benefits of Christianity to humankind far, far outweigh its deficits in terms of promotion of literacy, modern medicine, art, architecture, literature. The contribution of the Christian faith to humanity is simply incalculable. And the few abuses like the medieval crusades or the Inquisition are like fly specks on a canvas. But as I say, all of that is ultimately irrelevant because you do not judge the truth of a view on the basis of its social consequences.
It's a big pill to swallow, but that's good. Dr. Craig, I don't believe in God because it seems like it is against my natural urge to homosexuality.
Oh, okay. Is there a question there?
I can only guess, but that was just a statement from someone. I guess.
Well, and what I would say is your urges should not be allowed to determine what you believe is true or false. Suppose you were born with an urge to, say, alcoholism, and that you think that's incompatible with belief in God, to live a dissolute life. Or some people, I know a fella, he's psychopathic. He is born without natural feelings of human empathy toward other people. Does that mean that he should just act out on his psychopathism and harm people indiscriminately? Well, obviously not. Indeed, when you think about it, think about this, Daniel. The difference between a human being and an animal is that we don't have to simply act out our urges. We can control them by rational thought and by our will. And therefore, I just encourage our listener, do not reduce yourself to just following the urges of your body, but bring them into submission to your mind and your rational faculties. You're not an animal. And by the way, Daniel, that same advice goes for heterosexuals as well, right? Heterosexuals shouldn't just act like animals in heat. They also need to bring their passions and urges under the control of their rational thinking mind.
Because we also have sinful urges, rational urges as well. And so, it's good that, I get the balance. How can I trust God when the people who believe in him are not trustworthy?
Yeah, this was an obstacle for me as a teenager. Before I became a Christian, I was attending a large church in our community on my own, looking for answers. And all I found was hypocrisy. And it really turned me off, because I thought, here I'm so spiritually empty, but externally, at least, I'm living a better life than they are. And they claim to be Christians. They're all just hypocrites. But what really changed it for me was when I began to read the Gospels for the first time, and I read about the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was an authenticity about this man's life that was undeniable. And I knew then I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, regardless of the inconsistency and hypocrisy of people who claim to be his followers. It was very clear to me that Jesus was pure authenticity, and that I could claim him as my Lord and follow him as his disciple in good conscience, in a way that many other people who claim to be his followers do not.
All right, so you have mentioned Jesus quite a bit. I think this listener over here brings up a question in light of that. So belief in God is one thing. To worshiping one of the many is quite the step. How do you know which God to choose? So now you're talking about Jesus, but what's to say, in this pluralistic kind of society, we can't pick another God?
Right, absolutely. Good question. The arguments for the existence of God that I defend, like the cosmological, the teleological, and the moral argument, already narrow down the field of the world's religions to the great monotheistic faiths, because only they postulate a personal creator and designer of the universe who is perfectly good. So that already narrows the field down to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and perhaps deism. And so the question is, among those, are there reasons to think that one is true rather than the others? And here I think it is the person of Jesus of Nazareth. It is the attitude of these world religions toward Jesus that will be the key to discerning which one represents the truth. Islam has a historically false view of Jesus of Nazareth. The Quran incorporates into it legends that grew up for centuries before Muhammad finally recorded them in the Quran some 600 years after Jesus' death. By contrast, the Gospels were written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses while the first generation was still alive. And so the Quran contains demonstrably legendary false stories about Jesus. In particular, the Quran denies that Jesus of Nazareth was ever crucified. Now, the crucifixion of Jesus, Daniel, is the one historical fact about Jesus of Nazareth that is universally recognized by contemporary critics. No matter how radical, no matter how skeptical, the crucifixion of Jesus, his death on the cross by Roman crucifixion, is undeniable historically. And yet, ironically, this is the fact that Islam has chosen to reject, and thereby, I think, shows decisively that Islam is not the true monotheism. Similarly, I don't think Judaism can make good sense out of Jesus. I think Judaism is true and it leads up to Jesus, but then it can't really explain who Jesus was. Neither can deism. Deism doesn't allow for miracles. And yet I think we have very good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead and was vindicated by God in this way. God has vindicated those radical claims whereby he put himself in God's place. So I think it's the evidence for the reliability of the Gospels, and especially for the historical resurrection of Jesus from the dead, that authenticates Christian theism as the true monotheism.
I'm having a great dialogue with a Muslim friend of mine, and so this is just from experience over here. He mentioned, and I think it's a popular understanding about the Judeo-Christian Jesus, is that he did exist, but he was considered like a decoy, like he wasn't the real Jesus. The real Jesus from the Quran was just a mere prophet, but the Jesus over here in the Judeo-Christian, there's a bit of a fallacy behind the guy. So even if he states that he is God, he wasn't really God because he was a decoy to the real thing who was just a prophet. What would you say to that?
I think that there's some misunderstanding here of what Islam teaches, either on his part or on your part, perhaps. Islam has a very, very exalted view of Jesus of Nazareth. He is not a mere decoy. For Islam, he is the greatest prophet to have lived, even greater than Muhammad. He was the Messiah. He was born of a virgin. No Muslim would ever depreciate Jesus of Nazareth. But unfortunately, the Quran denies that he was crucified and died for your sins and rose from the dead. And thereby, I think Islam disqualifies itself as the true historical account of Jesus of Nazareth. As I said, the Quran was written 6 centuries after Jesus, and therefore no historian turns to it as a reliable source of information about the historical Jesus.
Was it ethical for Jesus to have died for the sins of humanity and for me without our consent?
Now that took an odd twist at the end, without our consent. Of course, it was ethical for him to do that. Why would he need our consent to die to save us? That doesn't make any sense at all. Suppose someone is in a burning building and a fireman rushes into the building and snatches that person from the flames and carries him to safety, or brings him to safety, but then perishes himself in the fire. does that fireman need your consent in order to save your life and sacrifice himself for you?
I hope not. I hope not.
No, of course not. I mean, think of those brave first responders who plunged into the twin trade towers on 911 to try to save people, and they gave their own lives for that. They didn't need to first ask their consent. So yeah, obviously, this is an act of tremendous mercy, love, and self-sacrifice to give your life to save someone else.
Christianity promotes restrictive or essential gender attitudes and roles. True or false?
True. Christianity says that God has made us male and female, and that his plan for human sexuality is heterosexual marriage. But due to either nature or nurture, many people have blurred lines of sexuality and gender that don't accord with the God-given pattern for human sexuality. And I believe that God has set this pattern not to be restrictive or to spoil our fun, but rather because he knows that this is the best way to promote human flourishing, to have human sexuality expressed within the safe and loving confines of a heterosexual marriage is the best way to promote true human flourishing, whereas these other aberrant lifestyles are often very self-destructive and have all sorts of negative consequences. There's an article that I wrote on our Reasonable Faith website called A Christian Perspective on Homosexuality that the listener might find helpful, where I talk about just what is a Christian perspective on sexuality and what are the consequences of ignoring God's guidelines for the expression of human sexuality. It's pretty eye-opening.
And what's the name of the article, sorry?
I think it's called A Christian Perspective on Homosexuality. There's a search feature on the website, and if you would just type in a couple of those key terms, it should locate it.
Next is, I don't believe in God because of the concept of hell.
Oh. Well, you know, what he would need to answer then is why that's rational. Why is it rational to reject the existence of God just because you don't like the concept of hell? Imagine somebody standing in the middle of the street and a friend from the curb yells to him, "Look out, here comes a car." And the person says, "Anybody who would run over me can't be a very nice person. I'll just close my eyes and pretend he doesn't exist. If I don't believe in him, then it doesn't affect me." And then it's too late. There's no reason that reality has to conform to our likes and dislikes. So if this listener has some good objections to the doctrine of hell, that would be one thing, and we'd need to deal with those. But if it's just that he doesn't like it, well, I'm sorry, there's no reason that reality has to conform to your likes.
I'm so glad you are answering these questions, Dr. Craig.
Well, these are such common questions in our culture, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I think most of them, as we've seen, Daniel, are really based on misunderstandings, thinking that the reason you become a Christian is because of what good it will do for you or what social consequences it will have. Or if there's something you don't like, then you're at liberty simply to think it's not true. So many of these objections to Christian belief are wrong-headed and falsely conceived.
Whereas you're accentuating the truth coach. Just coaching ourselves.
I want to emphasize to our listeners the question of the objectivity of truth. You can't determine whether the Big Bang occurred by whether it's appealing to you or not. Either it did or it didn't, regardless of whether you like it. So similarly, whether God exists or not, or Christ died for your sins or not, or hell exists or not, isn't dependent upon your likes and dislikes.
Thank you. Isn't the Bible just a book of Chinese whispers? The meaning changed through time and language interpretations.
Now, he asked, is it a matter of what kind of twisters?
So it was a she, and it was a language interpretations.
Okay. This is why I went to seminary and learned Greek and Hebrew, so that I can read these biblical documents in their original languages in which they were written. And I am not dependent upon translations of translations of translations. So having a grasp of the original languages will get around this problem. And you can read these documents in their first century or earlier context and compare them to other literature of that time so as to be able to understand the standard meaning of various Greek and Hebrew terms. And so while biblical interpretation is not always easy, nevertheless, I think we can get a very good handle on what the objective meaning of these documents is.
We're starting to run out of questions, but there's a pattern over here of questions on, you've mentioned the death and resurrection of Jesus. And this is, we get the vibe that's kind of like the crux of proof when it comes to the validity of God.
Not the validity of God, but the validity of the Christian
Okay,
God.
validity of the Christian God.
It's what distinguishes Christian monotheism from other monotheisms.
Right. Would you like to expand on that a little bit more, please?
Yes, after I finished my doctoral work at the University of Birmingham, I received a fellowship from a West German foundation called the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, which funded me to do a doctorate at the University of Munich in Germany. And my thesis topic was the historical credibility of the New Testament evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And what I discovered, Daniel, quite to my surprise, is that the central facts undergirding the inference to Jesus' historical resurrection are accepted by the wide majority of New Testament critics today. And I'm not talking about conservative scholars. I'm talking about the wide mainstream of New Testament historical Jesus scholarship. And these facts are 5 in number. Number one, that Jesus of Nazareth died by Roman crucifixion during the Passover feast. Secondly, that his body was then interred in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. Thirdly, that a group of Jesus' women or female disciples discovered that tomb empty on the morning of the first day of the week following his crucifixion. Fourth, thereafter, various individuals and even groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And finally, number 5, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Now, those are the facts. They are accepted by the wide majority of New Testament critics today. And in my published work, I lay out numerous lines of evidence in support of each of these facts. So the remaining question then is this: how do you best explain these facts? Well, it seems to me that when you weigh the various hypotheses in terms of the standard criteria for assessing historical hypotheses, like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, degree of ad hocness, and so forth, that the resurrection hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, emerges pretty clearly as the best explanation of those facts. So that on those grounds, one should rationally believe that God raised Jesus from the dead.
We have heard from a scholastic, intellectual, from just different kind of angle approaches towards understanding truth. From you, Dr. Craig, I love hearing all this. I'm a family guy. You know, we're all kind of personal beings. I wanted to hear, I guess, just to close us off before I make a final announcement about Seek Conference. What's your story? How did you become a follower of Jesus?
Well, I mentioned that I actually, as a teenager, was not a Christian. I wasn't even raised in a church-going family, though I had wonderful, loving father and mother. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask what I call the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? What's the meaning of my existence? And in the search for answers, I began to attend this local church in our community. But as I said, I didn't find any answers there. I just found hypocrisy. And so I began to reject the people in the local church because they're hypocrites and phonies. And pretty soon this attitude spread to everybody, Daniel. I thought everybody is a hypocrite. Everybody is a fake. They're holding up a plastic mask to the world while the real person is cowering down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And so I turned against people. I said, I don't need people. I hate people. I don't want them. I threw myself into my studies and shunned relations with people. And I was on my way, frankly, toward becoming a very alienated young man. And yet, in moments of honesty and introspection, when I looked into my own heart, I realized that deep down inside, I really did want to love and to be loved by others. And I realized at that moment, I was just as much a hypocrite as they were, because here I was putting on this brave face, pretending not to need people, when deep down inside, I knew I really did. And so that anger turned in on myself for my own phoniness and hypocrisy. And I don't know if you understand what this sort of inner anger is like, but it just eats away at your insides day after day after day, making every day miserable, another day to get through. Well, to make a long story short, I met a girl who sat in front of me in my sophomore high school German class, who was a radiant Christian. And I asked her one day what she was so happy about all the time. And she said it was because she knew Jesus Christ as her personal savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was so filled with hatred and anger. And she said there was someone who really loved me. And who was it but the God of the universe? And that thought just staggered me. So I went home that night. I got a New Testament. And I began for the first time in my life to read it. And I read the Gospels about the life and teachings of Jesus. And as I said earlier, I discovered there was a wisdom about this man's teachings I had never encountered before. There was an authenticity about his life that was undeniable. And I knew I couldn't reject him. And that began a search for me that lasted about 6 months. And at the end of those 6 months, I just came to the end of my rope one night and just cried out to God. And I just yielded my life to him, my all to him. And I cried out the anger and the bitterness that was in me. And at the same time, I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And I rushed out of doors. It was a warm September evening, and you could see the Milky Way from the horizon to horizon. And as I looked up at the stars, I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my whole life. because I had thought enough about this during those 6 months to realize that if I ever became a Christian, that I could do nothing less than devote my entire life to spreading this message among mankind. Because if this is really the truth, as we've emphasized today, if this is really the truth, then it is the greatest news ever announced. And so for me, my conversion to Christ was simultaneous with my call to Christian service.
What a way to finish. Thank you so much, Dr. Craig, for your humility, your transparency, just to be able to meet up with us for an hour and just to share what you have learned and experienced so that we get to the root of it, I guess. And I love it how you've accentuated the word truth. It's not a matter of preference, but getting straight to the truth of the matter and on such a huge topic. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Craig. And the Reasonable Faith, crew, I guess. That's us for tonight. My name is Daniel Tolefoa, and it has been a pleasure having you guys join us in this interview with Dr. Craig. So thank you.